Hey guys, it's Joe, and in this video I'll be doing an in-depth guide on Space Designer and how to create your own reverbs. I'll try and put some timestamps in or something, as some of this information is less important than other parts. I've set up a drummer track here which will send some reverb to on a bus, so we'll just go onto our buses and send it to that. Just go to a new bus, then put our reverb on it, go down onto reverb and choose Space Designer, and then we're met with this window. So first piece of information here is the output levels. You have the dry and then the wet signal. The dry is the original unaffected signal, and the wet is essentially the amount of reverb you want to use. When using reverb on a bus, always make sure your dry signal is muted so no original sounds are coming through the bus, and then make the wet signal the highest value. Now to actually get any reverb through, we need to send some signal on our bus, so I'm just going to click and drag this up, or just hold down Option and click to set it to 0 so it's nice and loud. Now we'll just solo our bus so we can hear just the reverb on the drums. Now we can experiment a bit. There are lots of different parameters here to achieve a unique sound. We have the envelopes up here and then the global parameters down here. These all shape the sounds but in different and precise ways, but we can also choose between a sampled impulse response or a synthesized impulse response. A sampled impulse response is basically just a sampled reverb that you can adjust. There are lots of different sounds to choose from, but you don't quite have as much freedom as you do with the synthesized impulse response. When using this, you'll basically make your own from scratch, but we'll just start with the sampled impulse response for now, as it's a little bit simpler. When using the sampled impulse response, you actually need to choose your sound, and you can either do that in the presets up here, or you can load it in from the menu here. We'll just go up into the presets and select one. I quite like the piano warmth sound, so I'm just going to select that and we'll adjust it from there. We'll start with the global parameters down here, and here we have the pre-delay, the length and the size. These will really help shape our reverb, whether it's a quick short sound or a longer bigger sound. The length will determine how long the reverb lasts until it's completely faded, and also works in conjunction with the size knob. The size will change the perceived size of the space the sound is in. And as you can see, when you change the size, the length goes down, but if you increase the length, the size doesn't go up. But you can really hear what this does if we listen to a length of 100 milliseconds in a 100% size room, and then the length of 100 milliseconds in a 10% size room. So let's listen to hear the difference. So you can quite clearly hear that the 10% size sounds a lot closer, even though the reverb length is the same. So when creating a reverb, think about how big of a sound you want something to have. I'll often use two reverbs, one big and one small. I'll perhaps have one on maybe 20% and another on 80 to 100%. Lastly, to give an impression of size, there's a pre-delay. Basically, this is the delay before reverb is actually played. In any situation, there is pre-delay, but it will be so quick you can't really tell it's there. It's the time between the initial source actually happening and making sound, and the first reflection of that sound bouncing off of a surface. You don't want this to be too long, as it can sound quite unnatural otherwise. Generally, a quick pre-delay works well on instruments like drums and percussion, whereas softer sounds like strings and woodwind work with a longer one, and this can really help to colour the sound. So let's have a listen. I've just unsoloed the bus, blended it back in with the drums, and we're slowly going to start to increase that pre-delay so we can hear what it's doing. So you can just about hear it here. Very clearly here, it sounds more like an echo or a delay now. So you can see why you want to keep it nice and short. You can also tempo sync this with your project so the delay is in time with the tempo, which is really cool for some creative effects. So something like that could work very nicely on a lead sound, not so much drums as it sounds very messy. I tend to keep this quite short. Anything below 10 milliseconds is good for drums, anything above 20 for softer sounds, but you don't always need it. Next is the crossover frequency, the low spread and the high spread. These are used to enhance the perceived width of the reverb. The low spread affects the frequencies below the crossover value, and the high spread affects the frequencies above it. These styles spread these frequencies to the sides to create a very wide sound. At the higher values, it means it's spreading those frequencies a lot. But at a value of 0%, no stereo or surround information is added. At 100%, divergence between the left and the right channels is at its most. This can be used in a number of ways. You can either use the low spread to really control and keep the lower frequency central, or you can use it to really spread the low end so it will make the reverb very warm and allow the reverb to encompass the whole mix. I recommend setting the crossover frequency anywhere between about 600 and 1000 Hz. And also dropping the low spread down just a little bit, but sometimes down as far as 50%. This is really worth experimenting with as every mix is different. And this crossover frequency might seem like a lot, but we're actually going to be removing a lot of this low end later anyway. I also always leave the high spread on 100% to make sure that that high end is nice and wide. So let's adjust this a little bit so we can hear it. We'll increase the crossover frequency so we can hear it a bit more as well. You can really hear that width and how the kick and the snare is sounding completely lifeless when it's down on 0. Of course, we wouldn't really add reverb to the kick anyway, but again, we'll cross that bridge very soon. However, if we just drop the low spread to about 60%, we'll hear it still has a nice balance. As I mentioned, we always want high on 100, but let's just reduce that to hear what happens. So on 0%, it's sounding very lifeless and dull there. In the next section, we have the input slider over here on the left, where you have 3 main settings. This configures the stereo channels, and it isn't on the mono version of Space Designer. The top setting is the stereo option, so the signal is processed on both channels, and this maintains the stereo balance of the original signal. The middle setting is mono, so it processes the signal as mono. The bottom setting is the cross stereo setting, where the signal is actually inverted, so left becomes right and right becomes left. This can be very interesting when you're using several reverbs, as you can create some very wide sounds. The in-between positions of these are a mixture of stereo to mono and mono to cross stereo. You can quite clearly hear the hi-hat switching sides between stereo and cross stereo there. I always just leave this setting on stereo. You don't really need to find a blend between any of these settings. Stereo works fine. Above this we have the quality, and this is literally the quality of the reverb. If you set it to high, it will match the sample rate that you're using and it creates a smooth, clean sound. Low and lo-fi produce a grainy reverb. So let's have a listen to compare them. To be honest, unless you're literally making lo-fi music, just use the high quality one. Next is the impulse response offset. This lets you set the playback start point of the sample that you're using. So you can see as I change this, the waveform above also changes with it. It's changing the starting point on the reverb so it creates a different sound. As you can hear, it sounds quite different every time you move it, so it's worth experimenting with to see if you can find a nice spot, but most of the time the best spot is the original spot. Next is reverse, which of course reverses the reverb. However, this isn't exactly like a reverse reverb effect where it plays before the sound leading into it, it still plays after the source. So to demonstrate what I mean, I'm going to increase the length quite a bit, hit reverse, unsolo the bus and have a listen. There is lots of potential when using this. You can create a new track and copy your reverb onto it but reverse it, then carefully place your sounds to create that reverse reverb effect, or you can use it as almost like a suction vacuum sort of effect, but it's very cool however you want to use it. And lastly in this section we have the action menu. Most of this is self-explanatory. As you can see, this is used to reset the filters, which is very useful, but you also have the volume and latency compensation. The latency compensation works solely for latency within Space Designer, not Logic. So it can help Space Designer generate the reverb a bit quicker, but you can't really be used with the lower lo-fi quality reverbs as they take quite a lot of power. In general, I've never actually had to use this. The volume compensation attempts to match the perceived volume differences between the IR files. This basically makes sure that the volumes are consistent, but again I've never had to use this, just make sure it's on. Lastly, down here we have the show Bezier handles, and I'm really hoping I'm pronouncing that correctly. I'll show you what they do. It's quite handy, and it makes adjusting these envelopes a lot easier. So it puts these new nodes in that we can then click and drag, so when it's off you can't see them, you have to drag it like this, but when it's on you can click and drag them, and it just feels a lot easier. Next we have the envelope windows, and this is the volume envelope that's been here the whole time, and we'll adjust that. All of these parameters can be changed by either clicking and dragging these nodes, or clicking on the values themselves, dragging them up or down, or double clicking and typing the values in. This envelope is used to set the initial reverb level and control the volume for the duration of the reverb. The initial level sets the starting level of the reverb. Keeping this at 100% ensures that loud early reflections are coming through, but interesting results can occur if you have it fade in. So we can just drop this down, and then we can actually use the nodes to shape it a little bit, so we can see we're almost shaping like a fade in. So those early reflections are a lot quieter, but for a natural reverb we want those early reflections nice and loud. The attack field sets the time before the decay kicks in. This can essentially work like a fade as well if we use it with the initial level. For natural reverbs I recommend keeping the attack quite short, so you get lots of those nice loud early reflections very quickly, but they'll soon die out. Next is the decay, and this essentially determines how long it takes for the reverb to die out. You can adjust how long it takes to go from our initial level to our end level over here. Now the decay can only be so long, but if you want to increase it, you have to actually increase the length down here, because as you can see, the attack and decay times add up to the overall length. You can shorten the decay by all means, but you can't increase it unless you increase the length like so. Lastly, as I mentioned earlier, we have the end level. This is the volume that the reverb will finish on. If you set it to 0, you can have it fade out with a nice tail, but if you set it to 100%, you can't. Again, that's very unnatural, so I recommend anywhere between 40% and 0, depending on the length. Now we'll have a quick listen and compare at the different levels. So here you can hear it's very loud, and now it falls off quite a lot. This is certainly worth playing around with, but if you want more of a natural sound that dies off, set it between 0 and 40%. We also have the EXP and LIN buttons. The EXP generates a natural sounding reverb curve, and the LIN generates a less natural one. As you can hear, they do sound quite different, and I definitely preferred the EXP. Next is the filter envelope. Now you don't really have to use this at all, but you can get some very creative results with it. This can actually also help to shape the actual sound of the room that your reverb is in. Firstly, you actually need to engage it and press the power button because it's just in bypass otherwise. And we have several different options in the bottom right with this filter pop-up menu. We have a 6 dB low pass, a 12 dB low pass, a band pass, and a high pass filter. Of course, as these are filters, they will be removing frequencies. The low pass will remove anything above a set frequency, high pass will remove anything below a set frequency, and the band pass will remove anything either side of a set frequency. In this demonstration, I'm just going to go for a low pass 12 and we'll take it from there. The initial frequency field sets the cutoff frequency for the filter. This will determine what frequencies are being cut. So in this instance, we're cutting out everything above 3557 Hz. The attack field sets the time that it takes to reach the break level, which is over here. And the break level is the maximum filter cutoff frequency. This will determine a large portion of the sound. This also acts like a separation point for the attack and the decay. So by setting the break level lower than the initial level, you can create some very interesting sweeps. And the decay sets the time it takes for the break level to reach the end frequency value at the end here. And the end frequency value sets the cutoff frequency at the end of the decay phase. Now I'm just going to put a quick setting on to show you how to get some cool sounds out of it. Okay, as you can see, I've set the initial frequency here, so it's cutting out everything above 2300 Hz. So this is to replicate a very dark sounding room. And then I've just used the nodes to help shape it. You can also increase the resonant frequency volume down here to help bring out some of those points. Can be used subtly or extremely. It actually goes very high, it goes all the way up to 60, and it sounds like this on 60. So you can get some very interesting results with that. I'm just going to turn this off again as we don't really need it, and now we'll have a look at the output EQ. This is purely to apply a channel EQ to your reverb. This works like any other EQ. What I recommend is using the high pass to remove anything below around 150 to 200 Hz. This is why we can have that high crossover value. You can also take out some high end using a low pass, not a great deal, it's just if it sounds quite brittle. I do actually like using a high shelf with this as well, just to give it some more presence in that high end, just if it's lacking a bit, but it's quite a careful balance. So this is how it sounds with the EQ on. And that EQ has just removed all the boominess of the kick. Now we're going to have a look at the synthesized IR. As you can see here, it's already got the filter envelope on it, but we've also got a new one, which is this density envelope. This is to control literally how dense the reverb sounds. Now down here we have the initial density. This is the average number of reflections in a given time within the reverb. If you set this lower, you can hear some of the reflection patterns and the echoes. So when using this, you also have to bear in mind how large you want your room to sound. If it's a larger room, the echoes are going to be sparser. If it's a smaller room, they're going to be quicker and more rapid. The ramp time is similar to the attack in that it sets the time between the initial and the end density levels. If you're using this, I tend to keep it quite quick because again, you want it to sound quite natural. It builds up very quickly, quite seamlessly. The end density sets the final density of the reverb tail. If this is low, it can sound very grainy and poor quality. So it sounds much more full up here. Next is the reflection shape, and this determines how the early reflections sound. Low values can sound quite sharp, whereas the higher values can sound quite smooth. So we're just going to have a look at the filter envelope here too. We'll just bypass it, listen without. So you can hear it sounds quite brittle and quite nasty there. But with it, it's still helping to shape that room. Using a combination of this and the density and the volume envelope, you can actually basically create any shape room that you want. It's just very complicated and takes a lot of time. Having used Space Designer a lot and having played with these settings, I definitely prefer the sampled IR. It's a bit simpler as you don't have the density to consider as well, and it sounds a little bit more natural to me. That being said, I believe that the possibilities are greater using the synthesized IR as you're not just tweaking a sampled reverb. When creating your own reverbs, the global parameters and the envelopes are essential to creating your own unique and specific sound. If you're using the sampled IR, find a sample that you like and adjust it to make it your own. Also experiment with the low and the high spread settings, as that will really help with the width and it can control the warmth of the sound. Of course, using the length and the size is really going to be crucial to get the actual size of the reverb correct that you're after. I'm just going to quickly make a short sounding reverb to demonstrate how I've tweaked things to create more of a unique sound that I want to use. So I've gone for this, I've gone for a quick reverb of about 50 milliseconds so it dies off quickly, much smaller size so it sounds much more close, and I've also still put a little bit of pre-delay on there. I've of course kept this in stereo. I made the crossover frequency about 1K so I can have nice control over those low ends and the low mids, and I've also kept the low spread quite narrow so again I can keep that control over it. And of course I've still kept the high spread at 100% so the high end is nice and wide. On the volume envelope, I've kept the initial level at 100%, so we have lots of loud early reflections. Kept the attack nice and quick, so we have those early reflections, but they don't stick around for too long. Then I've just got quite a gentle curve where it cuts out quite gradually and then gets a little bit steeper towards the end, and then it's not quite finishing on 0%, so we're still keeping some of that volume in there. And here's what it sounds like with the drums. I also kept that EQ from before on, so we're just reducing that muddiness from the kick. Space Designer is a very good reverb and has fantastic potential if you learn how to use it properly and really practice with it. Of course, there are simpler reverbs out there which give a great result very quickly, but they don't quite have the options that Space Designer does. I hope you found this video useful, and if you have any questions, please leave a comment or contact me via my website. Thanks a lot for watching. Cheers.